So DNS on Ubuntu, coming off of a great last week because we didn't have class or anything, so that's awesome. So as far as correcting anything on any of the previous labs, feel free to do that. The whole point of this class is to get it right. So if you find out that it is not right, then go back and make it right. So I get it. And this is what pretty much every admin goes through. You're going to get it to the point where you think it's working, and then you do something else, and you realize that it wasn't working the way you thought it was, and then you have to go back and fix it. That is your job. So in this class, I expect you to work it that way. Cool.
My P button won't work.
Oh.
And that's part of my fucking password.
Oh, no. Well, yeah. We'll come back to that here in just a minute. I'm sure we can massage it into working. So, DNS on Ubuntu. You're going to do pretty much the same exact thing that you did on the Windows side. You're going to remove all DNS from pfSense, and this is per interface. So you have to do this per interface. Well, maybe not. Now that I think about it, I don't think it is. As long as it's turned off, you're golden. So to install DNS, install the bind9 package, bind9 utils, and bind9-docs. The two more important ones are the first two, obviously. But bind9 utils contains a check zones command that will help you figure out whether or not you're writing your zone correctly. If you've got typos in it, it'll come back and tell you exactly what it is. So you'll need to find the named.conf.options file. I'm not telling you exactly where it is because you have commands at your disposal that will help you find files on a system, if you remember. That's the hardest part, right? If you took good notes, you might remember. Or you might just remember. In that file, you're going to find a few different options that I want you to tinker around with. Allow-transfer. This is talking about a zone transfer. Zone transfers are basically where one DNS server asks another DNS server to hey, I'm a new DNS server on your network. Can I please have all of the answers to all of the questions that anybody might ask? And enumerating a DNS server is actually one of the things that, as a security auditor, security researcher, somebody that's going into a network and doing some penetration testing, it's one of the first things they try to do. Because that is an entire map of your network, right? Every name mapped to every DNS or every IP address. And a lot of times those names are pretty descriptive, right? ADDS might be a name that you have on your network, and that would easily tell us exactly what that server does. May not be everything it does, but it gives us a good idea. So we want to turn that on, turn that off. So setting it to none. Then listen on. So another thing that a security auditor might do is probe your network for how many different interfaces are listening for DNS. Now, if you have multi-home to box, meaning it lives on more than one network, so it's probably got more than one network card, or it's on multiple VLANs or something like that, you might have multiple listen on IP addresses. You can also say listen on all, to where it listens on every single interface that's installed. In our case, we want to, narrow it down to just Ubuntu's IP. This will, in case you add a secondary network card, tertiary, whatever the fourth word for that is, you add a bunch of network cards to it, it will still only listen on one IP address, the one that you have listed here in named.conf.options. Then forwarders. Whoever you're forwarding to on Windows Server 2016 is the same set of IP addresses you should be forwarding to on Ubuntu, right? Ubuntu will be the main primary DNS server, but when it doesn't know an answer like where is google.com, who does it forward it on to? That is the answer you want here, right? 8.8.8.8 is good, 1.1.1.1, 9.9.9.9. There's a bunch of public DNS servers that you can use. Those are fine. So use those. Now, The reason we start out with Windows is to familiarize you with some of the words that you're dealing with, but Windows really kind of blindfolds you to a lot of what's actually going on in the background, which is not a good way to learn things, but it is a good way to become familiar with some stuff. So in Linux, you're going to realize, if you haven't already, that you got to know what you're doing. Now, you may not know the command to do it, you may not know where the file lives, and you may not know exactly how to type it. But the underlying understanding of how an A record works, or even what an A record is extremely important. Because once you create this zone file, a forward lookup zone file, and you don't know that A records go in there, you're kind of up a creek. And it has nothing to do with knowing Linux or not knowing Linux. It has everything to do with the fact that you might not be as learned as you needed to be on DNS before starting this lab as you should have been. So that's not to say that you can't get there during a week or two, but just that when you don't know what these words mean, it's time to go and do a little bit of digging. That NDS book that you guys had from the Windows Server class, that is a good way to get at least up to speed on some of the basic terminology that you need to get here. So, like forward lookup zone, right? What lives in a forward lookup zone? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so A records. Some basic information about, well, at least in Ubuntu, some basic information about how that particular lookup zone should behave. But a lot of the defaults are fine on that. As you learn a little bit more about DNS, and that's kind of out of the scope of this class, but as you learn a little bit more about DNS, you can actually start to tweak some of those numbers and deal with the performance of your DNS server, right? Once you start getting 50 to 100 people hitting your DNS server all day long, you might want to start tweaking those numbers, but if it's just 3 or 4 people, it's not really that big a deal. So as far as all that goes, you're probably okay with most of the defaults. Now, here is the deal. I am not going to specifically hold you to keeping everything in zones. However, every single time anybody ever comes up to me with a DNS problem, I ask them where their zone file is, and they just shrug at me. Well, you make it. So not knowing where it is not really acceptable. So I'm recommending that you create a directory called zones in the etc bind directory. A directory called zones. And then I want you to copy etc bind db.local, this one, to a file. I don't care what you call it, but the typical recommendation is db. Whatever the name of your zone is, right? db.win.lchavez.io, right? It does not matter what you call this file, but for the love of God, make it descriptive. You're gonna end up shooting yourself in the foot if you just call it something like db. db of what? So make the file name descriptive, and feel free to add comments in the file. Now, the way that bind works, comments are semicolons. So they end lines, and they create comments within lines. So if you start it with a semicolon, if you start a line with a semicolon, it is a comment. So feel free. Not in bind 9. Not in the configuration files for bind 9. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, well, bind 9 is not necessarily Linux specific. It is a Unix tool that is used in more than Linux. So you have some rules that just aren't Linux rules. So anyway, I mean, works in FreeBSD, works in Unix basic, works everywhere. Bind is one of the big boys that's been around for a long time. So anyhow, make it descriptive, put it in etc bind zones. That way, when I ask you the question after you're running into issues, where is your zone file? You're not fumbling around trying to look through a directory that has 20 other files in it. You don't know what you named it because you named it something super generic, right? Right. So put it in zones. Anyhow, once you do that, just copy db.local to etc bind zones and then whatever you want to name it. Am I going to count off for you not putting it in zones? No, but I am going to be a little upset with you if you don't know where your file is. So I'm harping on that a lot, and I know, but this is like the 6th or 7th time I've run this class, and there's always someone in every semester, where's your zone file? Oh. So don't be that guy. Then change the name within, there's an example line down in there. change that to the domain names for your pfSense machine and your Ubuntu machine. Right? Same as you did in Windows, except there's no right click in Linux. You type it out. So if your pfSense name is router, then you tell it the IP address, tell it the type of record, A, tell it IN, you'll see that, and then you give it the name, or I'm sorry, the IP address. So if your router's name is router, it would be router tab A tab IN tab IP address. That's what it would look like. And then you end each line. So if you're curious, let me see if I can find the Ubuntu one. Oh, that was it right there. This gives you an idea. So remember I said forwarders? If you're ever curious how to write it, boom, there it is. Right there. Right in the official Ubuntu documentation. And you're like, I changed my forwarders. How do I restart the service? Boom! Right in the official Ubuntu documentation. How do I define the zone file? Right in the Ubuntu. You see the pattern here? Everything I'm asking you to do, there is an example already written for you to take advantage of. This @ symbol in the zone file means this guy. So @ means this machine. It is the same thing as the loopback address, 127.0.0.1, right? So that is what that is. And then you need to define its name. For the name server, you want to put the fully qualified domain name in there. For everything else, you can get away with just the IP address. If you do an IPv6, that's what it'll look like. This is an example of a full A record. So your pfSense will look like that, except the name will not be NS. It will be whatever the name of your pfSense machine is. Then you hit enter and you create a new line. You do the same thing for Ubuntu. And every single time that you make a change in that bind or in that configuration file, you need to restart bind. You can make 20 changes. Well, I'm saying every time you make a set of changes and you want those changes to be active now, you have to restart the service. Now, here's the other thing. You can get away without doing it, but it is proper to give the DNS server an idea of how many times you have changed this zone file. So when you open it up for the very first time, it's going to have 1 in there. So every time you go and make a change, you add a record to it. You edit a record because the IP address changed or something like that. You increment that number by 1. So if you have edited this file 10 separate times on 10 separate days, that number should be equal to 10. Or 10 separate times over 5 separate days. It's still 10. Every time you make a change in that file, increment that serial. You can wait until the file is actually working to do that. Right? If bind never loads, then it doesn't actually know that you've changed anything. So it's no big deal to do that. And then reverse lookup looks very much like the forward lookup zone because it is. All it does is the opposite of what the forward lookup zone does. So instead of the names being on the left-hand side and the IP addresses being on the right-hand side, you just have IPs on the left, names on the right. But Leo, you say, that is not an IP address. Do y'all see that? Do y'all see that? That is not an IP address. Right? Wait. There, how about now? You see? Okay. All right. So, do you see that that is not an IP address? Yeah, it is not an IP address. You know why? Because your reverse lookup zone, just like in Windows, defines the very network that you're working on. So why do you need to tell the zone file what the network is when you've already defined what the network is? All you're giving it is the last octet. So if your router's IP address is 192.168.1.1, what number goes right here? 1. That's it. If your IP address is 192.168.1.194, 194 goes right there. Right? Y'all with me? Okay. These are the issues that I get every time, so I'm trying to knock them out. And then, yeah, same thing. Once your file is working and you make changes after the fact, increment that serial by 1. Oh, the other thing, on both these zone files, this needs to be your DNS name. So win.lchavez.io, and it does end with a period. That is not a typo. And then that, you can leave it as root, but example.com has to change to meet your actual DNS name. This is actually, turns out, the email address of the person that you might be trying to contact about DNS issues. The @ gets transformed into a dot. So that would read root@example.com if you were actually emailing somebody, but in the DNS zone file, that @ changes to a dot. So pretend you're writing an email. You can even write it out just like an email, but go back and change that @ to a dot. You'll be good. So domain name, guy that administers the domain. Leave it as root, or you can put your name in it. Doesn't really matter. We don't have an email server, so it does not matter in the long run. And yes, there's a dot at the end of that. These are, you can think of these as statements. Every statement ends in a period. All right. I think that is pretty much all of it. Let me double check. Restart. Cool. I think that's it. This looks sort of kind of like Ansible. I think it looks well. No, you're right. Ansible does have a lot of that stuff. All right. Okay, so when you come back over here, you're going to realize that everything that we went through in the configuration comes up in here. Right? We looked up the forward lookup zone, the reverse lookup zone. I'm telling you to copy some files over into the zones directory, named.conf.local. If you go into configuration, it tells you exactly where that file is. But I'd like you to find it using something like locate. Remember that command? Locate will tell you exactly where it lives. It'll even tell you where backups are. And please, for the love of God, what Pete said earlier, when you are configuring a file, back it up first. Make a copy of it. So you have named.conf.local, copy it first. Copy it to named.conf.local.backup or something. That way, when you inevitably blow that file up, you'll be good. You can always copy it back. It's not a big deal. You'll always have that baseline. That is important. Because if you don't have your base file and you totally bork it up, what are you going to do? Are you going to hand type it from your neighbor? I hope not. Because hand typing anything really introduces a lot of errors. Anyhow, once you're all done with the DNS stuff, you got to go into dhcpd.conf. Yeah, you thought we were done with DHCP. It all comes back around. Those options, they are changed now. We didn't originally define domain dash name. Now we have to. Make it your domain name. win.lchavez.io in my situation. And domain name servers. That used to be pfSense. It could also possibly have been public DNS servers. Now, it needs to be Ubuntu. It has to be. Ubuntu is your new DNS server. It is the only one that knows the answers to all your questions. And then, if you set up forwarders correctly, it'll forward on your queries to whatever you set up so that all the other questions that Ubuntu doesn't know the answer to can still get answered. Reboot Linux Mint. There's also what is that command? I'm drawing a blank right now. DH client. DH client-R is the equivalent of ipconfig/release, and DH client by itself is the same as ipconfig/renew. So DH client-R, then DH client. For some crazy reason on Ubuntu 18.04, sometimes you just have to run that pair twice. I do not know the answer to that question. It's worked fine on other distributions, so weird. And Linux Mint is based off Ubuntu 18.04. So at that point, now that you have the IP address and all the good information, use nmcli dev show to verify the changes, and then look up all that stuff. pfSense is fully qualified domain name. pfSense just the host name. pfSense IP address. So you need 2 forward lookups and a reverse. Same with Ubuntu. 2 forward lookups and a reverse. Then take a screenshot of all the results. They should all, none of them should fail. If any of them fail, you need to go back into whichever zone you're dealing with. So if it's forward lookup zone, you go to the forward lookup zone file, right? Fix that file.
So if you're getting a fail on non-assistant domain, that would be
Usually, what?
the receiving end?
That's usually the DNS server telling you, I don't know what you're talking about. So non-existent domain is typically talking about the host, though. Because if some stuff works and some stuff doesn't, is that what you're dealing with? Yeah. The DNS server is coming back and tell you, I don't have a record for that. So maybe add a record for that. Or there's a typo somewhere. Typo is quite likely. Bind is very picky. All right. Then use a browser in Linux Mint to go to, and please, guys, come on. Don't type that. Don't. Why are you doing that? Don't do that. That should be your fully qualified domain name for pfSense. That is your thing, not mine. I don't know what you set it to, and you surely didn't set it to pfSense FQDN, so why in the world would it resolve? And here, please don't do that. Whatever its host name was, that's what you put right here. The https:// can stay, but this stuff has to change. That cannot be the same. Right? And pfSense is picky as well. If you're not calling it by the name it knows itself by, then it's going to complain at you. But as long as you get that particular page, then that's fine. That will work. If pfSense is talking to you on a host name you have created for pfSense, then you're golden. Double check with me if you're worried about it, but you should be golden. Now, Will, that was interesting because it should respond on HTTPS. I don't know why it's responding on HTTP, but not HTTPS. That is extra weird.
I know on mine, whenever I did it for the window DNS, I had to actually go into pfSense's settings, and there's a setting in there for to use HTTP.
Did you freeze, or did you just...
What? Maybe you froze, man.
I didn't hear you for a second, that's why...
You're probably on mobile?
No, I'm at the house now.
Oh, I don't know. You got me, man. What was that, though? So you were...
So, yeah, so for mine, it wouldn't work initially on HTTPS. It would just, it would say, could not find. But it would be fine if I did HTTP. So I went into pfSense's settings and checked, and there's a setting in there where you can change the protocol that it uses. It has HTTP set by default, but you can change it to HTTPS. And then when I did it, it worked.
Did you guys answer yes to the web configurator protocol question down at the very bottom during the initial startup of pfSense? If you said yes, that would explain this. If you said yes to the do you want to revert to HTTP protocol during that initial line of questioning, then yeah, it won't be responding on HTTPS. And that would explain why you had to go check that box, because pfSense is HTTPS by default.
I know I changed, I don't know if that would make a difference, because I know whenever I first ran into it, I reset webcam, just through pfSense, through the pfSense VM itself, to make sure. But that still didn't work, so.
Interesting. Okay. Well, there may be something going weird. Well, we already ran into some issues that they had fixed a couple years ago that reverted back, where DNS resolver doesn't always work. You have to use forwarder instead in pfSense. That was weird. That was extra weird. Not everybody ran into that, which is why it's extra weird. So, Anyway, yeah, that's it. So as you go through, take a screenshots of commands. There we go. Maybe I should just start calling them command shots for Linux, right? Because most of them are commands anyway. Yeah, so go on through, do those things, answer those questions, use this file on the internet to help you with examples and explanation, right? tells you about those things. Increment the serial number every time you make changes to the file, right?
Is that like a security thing?
Essentially, and then that way, bind knows when to actually make changes. It doesn't. If you reload the service and it sees the serial number has not changed since the last time, then it won't even bother going through the file. But if you do increment the serial, then it'll actually parse through the file and add any kind of record that it needs to add. So serial is useful. Security is actually one thing that comes out of that, but I think it was unintentional. But yeah, still, totally worth dealing with that in the proper way. So anyway, that's it, guys. That is it. As Renee says, go forth and conquer. And then ask me when it blows up. Feel free to ask me.